The aroma of freshly ground beans still clung to the kitchen tiles when Sophia first noticed the tremor in Marcus's hand. It was barely perceptible, his thumb skating a millimeter too far across the screen of his phone as he laughed at something she had said about the neighbor's cat, but it lodged under her ribs like a splinter. They were sitting at the round oak table they had carried home from a Bergen flea market 5 summers ago, the one with the pale moon-shaped stain where Marcus once forgot a coaster under a mug of glue. Outside, the October rain erased the city in soft grey strokes, and inside the warm circle of lamplight their knees touched the way they always had, as if their bodies had been carved from the same block of wood and still remembered the grain. Marcus reached across and folded her hand inside both of his. His eyes were the exact color of the coffee. Dark, reflective, a surface you could fall into if you leaned too close. "I've been thinking about the cabin again," he said. "The one on Kvaløya, with the glass roof over the deck. We could go back next June, stay the whole summer, write, fish, maybe finally learn to identify all the constellations you keep mixing up." He spoke as though the future were a loaf of bread they had left rising on the counter, something they could slice whenever hunger struck. Sophia felt the old tug of longing, the midnight sun, the smell of sea salt in pine cracks, their bodies braided together in a sleeping bag too thin for two. She smiled, and the splinter under her ribs dissolved. The tremor must have been the caffeine. They made plans the way other people make grocery lists, quick, casual, as though nothing could spoil. They would rent out the Oslo flat, take the slow coastal ferry north, bring the old Nikon and the cracked French press. Marcus wanted to teach himself sourdough. Sophia wanted to finish the poetry sequence she had carried like a pocket of stones since before they met. They spoke of children again, tentatively, the way you touch a bruise to see if it still hurts. "One day," Marcus said, "we'll bring a third chair to the table." He squeezed her fingers so hard the tips blanched, then released, ashamed of his own urgency. Sophia's heart performed that small, familiar somersault. Hope, fear, wonder, grief, all 4 hooves landing at once. After the second cup she went to shower, leaving him humming to the radio, scrolling through playlists for the drive. The water was too hot. Her skin came out pink and humming. She wrapped herself in the towel that still smelled of the lavender soap her mother sent from Palermo, and when she opened the bathroom door the apartment was silent except for the rain. She assumed Marcus had gone to his study to answer the email from his editor, a small rebellion against their self-imposed digital Sabbath. She padded across the hallway, intending to coax him back to bed, and found him bent over his laptop at the desk they never used, shoulders high and tight like a cat about to spray. She meant to tease him. "Caught you," but the words backed up in her throat. On the screen was a grid of thumbnails, 6 across, 4 down, each a rectangle of flesh. For one blank second she thought it was pornography, the anonymous kind he swore he no longer needed, and she felt the petty sting of betrayal women are taught to swallow like aspirin. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw her own face. Not hers, exactly. A younger face, smoother at the jaw, hair longer and lighter than she had worn it since art school. But the tilt of the head, the constellation of freckles across the nose, those were hers, duplicated in every thumbnail, multiplied like a hall of mirrors. In some she was asleep on this very couch, in others she stood at the sink wearing only his discarded shirt, unaware of the lens. All of them had been taken inside these walls. During hours she had believed herself alone. She must have made a sound, a small click at the back of her palate, because Marcus spun around so violently the chair rolled into the bookshelf and spattered a row of paperbacks across the rug. His face went through 3 colors in as many seconds. The ruddy glow of arousal, the chalk of guilt, finally the grayish yellow of someone who realizes the ice was always thinner than he thought. He slammed the laptop shut, but the afterimage floated between them like a hologram. Sophia, unaware, unconsenting, curated. For a moment neither moved. The rain filled the room like the hiss of an old radio between stations. Then Marcus began to speak, stopped, started again, the words arriving broken-backed. "They're not. I never. I was going to delete them." The sentences collided. Meaningless. Sophia noticed irrelevant things. A flake of dry skin on his earlobe, the way his left sock had slid into the arch of his foot, the smell of coffee now turned bitter. She felt her knees buckle and locked them rigid. If she went down now she would never stand again. She lifted her hand, not to strike him, only to point, to anchor herself in space. And he flinched as if she held a blade. That flinch told her everything she needed to know. He had rehearsed this discovery, played it out in the mirror, and even his imagination could not invent a version in which he deserved forgiveness. The silence stretched until it became a living thing, a third presence breathing between them. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded like someone else's, thin and exact. "How long?" He shook his head. She repeated the question the way a carpenter repeats the tap of a hammer, driving the nail home. 2 years, he whispered. Maybe 3. Not every day. Just sometimes. When you looked. When I loved you so much it felt like I'd explode if I didn't keep a peace. His eyes pleaded for understanding, as though love could be measured in megapixels, as though theft could be redeemed by adoration. Sophia walked backwards until her shoulders met the doorframe. She needed the solidity of wood against her spine. Without it she might drift through the wall and find herself standing in the rain, molecule by molecule dissipating. Her mind performed the strange arithmetic of trauma. Subtract every moment she had undressed in this house, divide by the number of times he had kissed her good morning, multiply by the square root of every promise. The equation balanced on a single monstrous integer. 3 years of her life had been lived twice, once in innocence, once through the greedy eye of a lens. Marcus took a step toward her, hands raised, palms out, the universal posture of surrender. "Say something," he begged. But language had become a country whose border had just been redrawn. Every word she knew now belonged to the other side. She thought of the cabin, of the third chair, of the sourdough he would never bake, of the child who would now never sit at their table. The future they had needed together over coffee had proved to be made of blown glass. Beautiful, weightless, already cracked. She turned and walked to the bedroom, closed the door with the care of someone laying an infant down. She dressed, underwear, jeans, 2 sweaters, the wool socks her sister had knitted, layer by layer armoring herself against a cold that came from within. She packed nothing. Everything in this apartment had been contaminated by the lens, even the air. When she emerged, Marcus was still in the hallway, laptop clutched to his chest like a shield. He looked older, as though the last 15 minutes had been years, as though he had aged into the future they would now never reach. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see her own reflection in his pupils, small and perfect and trapped. "I loved you," she said, past tense, a small coffin of syllables. The words hung between them, irrevocable. Then she stepped around him, opened the front door, and walked into the rain. It tasted of metal and the sea. Behind her she heard him call her name once, the sound swallowed by the slam of the door. She did not go far, only to the all-night cafe on the corner, where the windows steamed and the waitress knew neither of their names. She sat with her back to the wall, hands around a cup she never tasted, and watched the street. After an hour Marcus appeared under the awning, coatless, hair plastered to his skull, searching the darkness like a man scanning a battlefield for his own body. She pressed herself into the shadow between the coat rack and the vintage pinball machine. He stood there a long time, shoulders heaving, until the waitress went out and offered him an umbrella. He shook his head and walked back into the wet, footsteps uncertain, as though the pavement might give way. Sophia stayed until dawn bruised the sky. She would go to her sisters first, then to the police, then to a locksmith who could change the cylinders of her life. She would discover weeks later that he had deleted the folder before she reached the corner, but that deletion was itself a kind of permanence, a negative space that outlined exactly what had been lost. She would learn to sleep again, though never in the dark, and she would write the poems, though they would be different, harder, flintier, each word bitten off like a thread. She would meet someone else, years downstream, who would hold her face in his hands as though it were a map he intended to memorize, and she would feel the minute tremor in his wrists and know that trust, once shattered, can be reassembled only grain by grain, like sea glass smoothed by decades of tide. But that morning in the cafe she knew only this. The future they had spoken of over coffee had already happened, secretly, in 1,000 stolen frames. And the only thing left for her to do was walk out of the picture entirely. She pushed open the door, stepped into the rinsed blue light, and did not look back.